Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's session at Bhava Samvad at the Kalinga Literary Festival. We are honored to have with us today Mr. Amish Tandon, who is a practicing lawyer in corporate and commercial law. We will be discussing his second book today on the very interesting topic of Indian citizenship and immigration law. Yes, you've got a glimpse of the cover of the book there. This is Mr. Tandon's second book. His previous book was also on a fascinating topic, which was the law of sexual harassment in the workplace. So clearly, he specializes in books on useful topics that are of interest both to lawyers and to general readers. So, welcome to the show, Mr. Tandon.
Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for having me.
So, we're going to start the session with a series of questions, and at the end of the session, we can also take questions from the audience. So, do keep your comments and questions flowing in. Mr. Tandon, in your book, you've mentioned that a person can become an Indian citizen in several ways. Right? Most of us are born Indian citizens. That's probably the easiest way to become an Indian citizen. But you can
That's
also
right.
become an Indian citizen by descent, by naturalization, and by OCI registration. So could you explain these various ways of becoming an Indian citizen for our audience?
Right. So what I'll in fact do, ma'am, is that I will break down
Yes,
in two lines each. I will summarize the various ways by which citizenship can be obtained or granted in India.
sure.
Citizenship by birth, of course, as the term suggests, is the most common and it's an automatic method where by birth you are granted or you become a citizen. You don't even need a grant or a license from any authority.
Just
Originally,
sorry
of
to
course,
interrupt you.
yes, ma'am.
I guess by birth you mean that either one or
By
both of
being
your
born,
parents,
by
yes,
correct. Yes,
and
so I'll
either
just
one or
come to
both of your parents should be Indian citizens, right?
correct. That's right. So what the
Yes.
original rule, what has really happened, if you see, is
Mhm.
originally these laws were more liberal and they have slightly
Right.
they've been tightened over the years in order
Okay.
perhaps to address the issue of illegal migration, which is in fact a very important and a very big problem in India.
Yes.
So the
True.
original position when it comes to citizenship by birth was the original position was that if, at least if one of the parents was an Indian
Mhm.
citizen, so then the
Yes.
newborn, of course, the
Hmm.
newborn being born in India becomes an Indian
Yes.
citizen.
Right.
In 80, yes, originally that was so there was there was no concept of parenthood, ancestry. These things were not relevant.
Yes.
And in fact, originally prior to 1987, in fact, even if there were two foreigners who were giving
Mhm.
birth to a person, to a child in India, that by
Mhm.
itself was enough for him to be granted Indian citizenship
Right. By virtue of being born in the geographical
by
region of
virtue
India.
in the
Yeah.
geographical, yes, in the Indian
No.
territory. In
Yes.
87, they, of course, they modified it slightly to say that at least one parent has to be an Indian citizen. That was step one towards tightening the norms.
Right.
2003 was the second one when they
Right.
said that one parent must be Indian citizen and the other must not be an illegal migrant. So I think
Right.
2003 was the first time where they really realized that it was very important to curtail the aspect
Yes.
of citizenship by birth also, and in an effort to ensure that illegal migrants do not become Indian citizens. That's what I feel. The second, of
Right.
course, is citizenship by descent. What does it really
Mhm.
mean? You are born outside India, but because of your connect in India, you are in a
Mhm.
position to obtain Indian
Yes.
citizenship.
Right.
So, if your father or your mother are Indian citizens, if you are born
Yes.
outside, you can still obtain Indian citizenship.
Yes.
Generally, this is used by uh, or this is there is of course there is a registration process here. This is not automatic like citizenship by
No.
birth. There is a
Yes.
registration process. I will not get in too much into the detail. Of course, the book uh,
Mhm.
clearly describes the entire process, but the idea
Yes.
here is that you must apply and you must obtain it as
Right.
against a situation. So normally, for for Indian citizens working abroad who have children abroad, they are in a
Right.
position to take the benefit of this concept.
Right.
The
So they can
third,
apply at any Indian embassy abroad. Is that right?
correct, that's broadly, yes, that's the correct.
Yeah.
So you apply at the embassy, there is a process, there is
Yeah.
your eligibility, etc., is checked, and you are granted citizenship thereafter.
Right.
The next one, of course, is citizenship by registration. Now,
Yes.
this is the process where mm, foreigners really become Indian citizens.
Right.
Registration and naturalization. So, I'll just quickly explain
Right.
what registration is. As the term suggests, you apply for and you are granted Indian citizenship.
Right.
There are several eligibility criteria that needs to be met for you to apply for
Mhm.
such citizenship. One is
Right.
marriage to an Indian citizen.
Right.
One is your stay in the number of years. There are a whole host of
Yes.
eligibility requirements, etc. If you are an
Yes.
overseas citizen of India, then you can, of course, obtain registration, Indian citizenship by registration, etc. The
Mhm.
process is involves making an application to a collector, scrutiny of the application at two levels, one at the collector's level and the second at the central government level,
Mhm.
ultimately giving and making an oath of allegiance, and once the government gives its
Mhm.
go ahead, obtaining Indian
Mhm.
citizenship.
Right.
So this is normally people, normally overseas citizens of India and marriage are the two
Mhm.
most common reasons
Yes.
for
Yeah.
obtaining citizenship by registration.
Right.
Then
Yeah.
comes citizenship by naturalization.
Mhm.
Now, that is by and large similar to citizenship by registration. In
Mhm.
naturalization, what really happens is that the process becomes a little longer. You'll have the duration is longer. You have to stay in India
Okay.
for at least 12 years and then make an application.
All right.
And by and large, the process again, the collector, central government, etc., the eligibility requirements and the scrutiny of your of the records and an ultimate decision is something similar to obtaining citizenship by registration.
Right.
The last one, of course, which we don't really speak about much, is by incorporation of territory. What does
Right.
this
Hmm.
This is where if an outside territory becomes a part of India, then the central
Hmm.
government is, and I would say duty bound
Hmm.
to, absorbs or grants Indian citizenship to persons of such territory. We've had
Right.
lots of cases like that. Pondicherry is one example in
Yes.
1962. Then
Huh.
you had Sikkim, which was originally a
Sikkim.
monarchy. In
Yes.
1975, they became a part of India. Then you have Goa,
Right.
Daman, and Diu in
Yes. Yeah.
1961. So there are some cases like that. So all these, so the inhabitants of of these states, eventually on
Yes.
becoming a part of India, were given Indian citizenship. So broadly, these are
Right.
the four and five ways by which a person can obtain or be granted Indian citizenship.
Very interesting. And thank you for explaining that so clearly.
Thank you.
Um, Moving ahead, the
Yes.
concept of Overseas Citizen of India, OCI, which you touched upon, was
Hmm.
introduced in 2004. Previously, there was the concept of PIO, or Person of Indian Origin. In
That,
2015, the government of India merged both these schemes. So, could you tell
correct.
us
That's
more
right.
about the benefits of OCI registration and how is it different from being an NRI, or a non resident Indian, which is a commonly used term?
Commonly used term. Yes. So in fact, we I cover it in pretty much detail in the book. Now,
Yes,
where does this start? This begins with the fact that Indian law does not recognize dual citizenship.
right.
What
Yes,
is dual citizenship? Of course, being permitted to simultaneously keep citizenship of more than one country. So
right.
there's no concept of dual or multiple citizenships, which is prevalent in India. So
Hmm.
the PIO or the OCI is the closest that you can get to a dual citizenship under Indian law.
Right.
So mind you, an OCI or a PIO, OCI means Overseas Citizen of India, PIO is Person of Indian Origin. These
Hmm.
persons are not citizens of India.
Correct.
These
Hmm.
are persons who have a past connect with India,
Hmm.
ancestors being in India, having a past connect. There are, of course, some eligibility. I will not go too much into detail, but yes. So, if you have a past connect, then you can apply for and obtain a registration and
Hmm.
become an OCI or a PIO. There are,
Hmm.
of course, several advantages that come with. So, like I said, you're not a citizen of India, so you can't vote in
Hmm.
India. You can't
Right.
claim parity with any Indian citizen.
Hmm.
You can't
Hmm.
stake claim to certain types of legal positions or certain types of jobs, etc., voting and all these things. But there are
Yeah.
certain privileges that come. Now, what are those
Hmm.
privileges? Very broadly, you will be able to get a lifelong visa to India.
Right.
So
Yeah.
you don't need to apply for a visa whenever you're coming to India. You will not
Right.
be required to get yourself registered like other foreigners whenever they arrive in India. So if you
Yeah.
whenever we travel abroad, maybe you would have noticed that there are these forms that
Hmm.
we are required to fill,
Yes. Immigration forms. Yeah.
immigration forms. So ultimately, these are records that ultimately are kept by the foreigners
The
office of the
government.
respective country. So
Yes.
similarly, when foreigners come to India, they have to fill up forms, and then there is
Hmm.
a there is a formal registration process. The idea is to have
Right.
a record keeping of these citizens of these foreigners whenever they're India. All of that is
Right.
dispensed with. You also have
Yeah.
certain other benefits such as you can apply for higher education in certain areas,
Hmm.
etc., which also come with
Hmm.
an OCI. But an OCI is not an Indian citizen. The
No.
PIO, originally it started with PIO, that
Hmm.
was a person of Indian origin.
Indian
They
origin. Hmm.
eventually, yes, also introduced OCI. They realized that there is an overlap because this caused a
Hmm.
lot of confusion. People said, should we take OCI? Should we take PIO? Which is better? So to
Hmm.
somehow quell that problem, they ultimately decided to merge the two cards. Over the
Hmm.
years, the merger has taken place, and
Hmm.
now, as of today, there is no concept of PIO card as in India. It's only OCI. So they've merged the two schemes
Right.
together. And
Right.
now when you say now that I have explained OCI, I like now the difference between an NRI and an OCI would be quite clear. NRI is non-resident Indian. So an
Right.
NRI is not somebody who's given up Indian citizenship.
Right. They're
So he
basically an
is
Indian
still an
living
Indian
in another
citizen.
country,
Yes, an Indian living
but
in
still
another
holding an
country.
Indian passport.
That's right. Holding an Indian
Yeah.
passport, an Indian citizen, he will still
Yes.
be considered, he will have all rights and privileges of an Indian citizen
Right.
versus an OCI who will not have those privileges, but of course will have
Yeah.
some privileges.
Understood. Thank you for explaining the differences between these three categories very clearly. I'm
Thank you.
sure it's very
Thank
helpful
you.
for our viewers.
Thank you.
So, moving ahead, since we've been discussing the whole concept of citizenship, this has been a topic of hot debate recently after the CAA or Citizenship Amendment Act was passed by Parliament on 11th December 2019. It amended the Citizenship Act of 1955 because the government felt it would help persecuted religious minorities in certain countries, such as Afghanistan, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. And these minorities could be Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, or
Correct.
Christians, and who've arrived in India before the end of December 2014. It would help them gain Indian citizenship by reducing the period of stay in India, which you had alluded to earlier, from a minimum of say 11 years, which is the requirement for naturalization, to 5 years.
5 years. That's right.
So the government claims that this act has been brought about to help these persecuted minorities. Why then has there been so much opposition to this act?
Okay, so let me, before we discuss the reasons of opposition, I think it would be good to explain what the CAA is really about.
Yes, of course, please
This is,
do.
of course, I'll try and simplify this so that at least the
Yeah.
viewer can really understand what the
Yes,
CAA really is.
yeah,
Now, Indian law prohibits an illegal migrant from obtaining Indian citizenship ever. So there is
right,
an absolute bar. So if you are
yeah,
once declared an illegal migrant, you cannot obtain. So none of these options of citizenship that we discussed initially,
yeah,
registration, naturalization, etc., none of these options are available to an illegal migrant.
right,
Now, who's an illegal migrant? Of course, somebody who either enters India illegally
true,
or who enters India through regular channels but ultimately overstays his welcome. Visa expires,
right,
doesn't go back, etc. So, either of the
right,
two situations, you're an illegal migrant. Illegal migrant can never be an Indian citizen.
yeah,
Now, what has the government done? The government in the CA, through the CAA, has added an amendment to this law or has carved out an exception. What is this exception? They say that, okay, the following persons belonging to the following faiths coming from the following countries. that is
Right.
Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and arriving of facing or perceiving religious persecution,
Right. Yes.
arriving in India before a certain date,
Yeah.
will be will get an opportunity to obtain
Mhm.
Indian citizenship. Now, mind
Yes.
you, that
Yeah.
has not really happened till date, because the government today even is in the process, we speak, is in the process of formulating rules
Yes. Yeah.
which will throw light on the mode and manner in which such beneficiaries of the CAA can actually obtain registration or obtain Indian citizenship through the processes described therein. So this
Right.
is the general rule, that if you are an
Mhm.
illegal migrant, no citizenship for you. Now, these are the
Yeah.
people who have been, there is an exception carved out, that you set
Mhm.
of people will give you the benefit.
Mhm. And the
Now,
benefit is essentially a shorter time span, right? That's really the only benefit. Yeah.
shorter time span, that's correct. That's correct.
Yeah.
Shorter time span. And also, you see, when I say an exception, so even if you're an illegal
Mhm.
migrant,
Right.
a
Huh.
beneficiary of
Huh.
the CAA today may or may not be
Mhm.
an illegal migrant. He may be an illegal
Right.
migrant, may not be also.
Correct.
But
Yes.
even so, the general rule, that is that no illegal
Hmm.
migrants to get citizenship, will not apply
Yes.
to this set of people.
Right. Right. So basically,
So
they claim, if they claim they're being religiously persecuted and can prove this, then it makes them
now that's another
potentially
topic
eligible.
of that's
Yeah.
another issue that, of course, I we'll have to see how. Like I said, the rules are not yet
Hmm.
out. I'm sure the government
Right.
will do its set of thinking and will probably come up with something to
Excuse me.
uh, throw greater light on how these
Yes.
aspects are to be. But insofar as but the government, insofar as this set is concerned, there's another aspect to it. The government,
Mhm.
in its report, clearly says that we have enough evidence to show that the
Right.
beneficiaries of the CAA either are or have been facing religious persecution. See,
In the
there is a
past.
common link
Yeah.
between the three countries. You see, all three are Islamic countries.
Yes. Yeah.
And when you're
And
an Islamic country
yeah.
or you're a theocratic state, what really happens is that your the entire constitution or your entire set of laws revolve around religion.
True.
So
Yeah.
that
And
does
yeah.
give advantage to a certain sect, and obviously some disadvantage to the others. That's always a possibility. So for example,
True.
uh, just to give you a very small example, so in the constitution of Pakistan there are some provisions which do not allow non-Muslims to obtain uh, government jobs,
Okay.
to apply and obtain things like that. There is a
Okay.
certain there is a certain committee or etc which is completely religion based, which has the power to overrule other laws which are
Okay.
otherwise made by the legislature if they feel that they are against the tenets of Islam.
I see.
So it's centered around religion. So they say
Right.
that
Yeah.
insofar as these three countries are concerned, there is ample evidence. History
Yes.
uh, tells us that there is has been and there is religious persecution going on.
Yes.
So this section, they are willing to give that benefit of doubt,
Right.
that when
And
if you are from there, then there is a very strong, either you're faced, or you are, or there is some potential or some likelihood of you facing religious
right. Yes.
persecution.
Yes.
Coming back to
Because
what
we
is the
have had, sorry to
yes,
interrupt.
yes,
So
please,
we
please, please,
have
ma'am.
had, no, we have had people from these countries coming to India seeking shelter because they have been persecuted in these
That's right.
nations.
That's correct. That's correct. So there have been instances. So the government says that this set of
Mhm.
people will give the benefit to.
Right.
So coming back to what is the reason for objection now,
Hmm.
the sets of objections, of course, we'll come to the Assam story later. In Assam, there is a
Yes.
slightly different set of
Separate.
grievances
Yes.
that they have. But insofar as
True.
the rest of the country is concerned, the critics are basically criticizing the fact of, they say there is discrimination.
Hmm.
Why should only these sections or these beneficiaries be given the benefit of
Yeah.
obtaining Indian citizenship, whereas the rest of the,
Hmm.
so there could be persons
Yeah.
of other faiths who may not
Yes.
who may
Yeah.
also be legal migrants,
Yeah.
but
So,
who
for
will never get the
example,
benefit.
right. So, for
That
example, there are thousands of Tibetan refugees in India who have
correct.
fled and
There
come
is
from
there is the
to Tibet
problem
to
of
India.
Tibet. There
Yeah.
is the problem of the Rohingyas from Myanmar.
Yes.
There is also the
Myanmar.
problem of, in fact, Hindus coming from Sri Lanka. because
Yes. Yeah.
the indigenous population of Sri Lanka, there are, of course,
It's
there are
Buddhist.
evidences to show
Yeah.
that they have been subjected to some sort of religious persecution,
Yes. In the
especially after
past,
the
definitely.
LTTE and that
Yes.
episode. So Hindus have been
Yeah.
subjected to. But
Yeah.
to cover that, there we already have a refugee policy. We are not
Hmm.
signatories to any international conventions. Let me be very clear with that. We are
Yes.
not. We
Yeah.
are not. But we have what we call as the SOP, the Standard Operating Procedure of 2011, uh, which is an executive order which
Mhm.
regulates refugees.
Right.
So it's not that we are a case where there's absolutely nothing to protect or prevent or to somehow give
Mhm.
assistance to refugees. We have that policy. That is, of course, that is through executive orders. Can be changed today, cannot be. But yes, that problem
Mhm.
is there. So with these other
Right.
countries, in fact, one of the opposition is also that why have you given benefit only to people coming from these three countries? Why not the other
Right.
remaining countries which we just discussed, Myanmar, Sri Lanka,
Right.
etc.? The government wishes to adopt a stance to say that the refugee policy will cover them, and that's actually a matter of fact. The refugee policy
Right.
does deal with, so in fact, the
Yeah.
refugee policy does deal with Hindus coming from Sri Lanka, the Tamils, etc., and also from Tibet.
Right. Yeah.
Now that is something that, of course, to say that why should only these people be dealt with under the SOP and why shouldn't the others be dealt with is, of course, is this
Yeah.
is one another cause of concern or another
Yeah.
criticism, if I would say, of the
Right.
people who are
Yeah.
not happy with the CAA.
Right. Yeah.
So the biggest problem, of course, is discrimination. They say
Mhm.
when our constitution says Article 14 says equality for
Right.
all. So why should
Yes.
there
Yeah.
be any distinction which is carved out, whether in
Mhm.
terms of
Mhm.
region, whether in terms of religion, etc.? So that's the
Right.
biggest
Mhm.
criticism. And of course other
Mhm.
criticisms, such as there are, see,
Mhm.
now when I can we can really divide criticism into several parts. Even when it
Mhm.
comes to religious persecution, there is some criticism, because there is
Right.
one
Yeah.
theory. They say that even in Pakistan also there is religious persecution even amongst the Muslim populace. You
Yes.
have
The
the issues of the
Ahmadiyas and so
Baloches
forth.
and the Ahmadiyas,
Yeah.
etc. So there is
Right.
some sort of a religious persecution even
Within
inter
Islam itself. Yeah.
within Islam itself. So now,
Yeah.
how should you define criticism, religious persecution, or what should be the
Hmm.
scope of religious persecution which you are willing to look at? Is also
Right.
another thing which has been raised. That
Yes. Yeah.
why, so what are the parameters that the government is looking at while defining the scope of what they think should be religious persecution for the
Right.
purposes of CAA?
Yeah.
So, so these are some of the common. Of course, the government has come out with some. They have their defenses. They've explained their position, and
Hmm.
but of course, the matter, as you're aware, is in the before the Supreme Court. So it remains
Right.
to be seen as to how the Supreme Court examines this as and when it gets taken up for hearing.
Okay. So we'll wait and see what the Honorable
Wait
Court
and
has
see.
to
Yes,
say.
correct. What the
Yeah.
Supreme Court, whether it passes muster or not, the CAA as a
Right.
whole.
Right. Um, Continuing on a similar line, the Citizenship Act provides the basis for the establishment of a National Register of Citizens, or NRC, and this empowers the central government to issue national identity cards. Given that there are already various ID cards issued by the government, such as voter ID cards and Aadhaar cards, why is there a need for yet another national identity card?
Okay, so this is, see, what the national identity card, or whether that's actually a part of the NRC,
Yes,
that is the National Register of Citizens.
citizens.
Now,
Yeah.
to me, an NRC is nothing but a housekeeping exercise.
Right.
Why
Yeah.
shouldn't a country have a record of its
Yeah.
citizens? Why
Of
shouldn't, and
course.
especially a country which is riddled with illegal migration, such as India,
True.
where
True.
we
True.
witnessed illegal migration for the last 60, 70 years?
True.
So,
But there are these
I don't.
existing cards. So are they not enough? Uh,
Now that is another, there's another aspect to it. Now we all know how identity cards are sometimes even issued in the country.
hmm.
I don't, just because somebody has a driving license, or somebody, whether somebody has an Aadhaar card. In fact, the Aadhaar Act goes on to say that this
Hmm.
is not proof of citizenship also.
Right. Yeah.
It's only a
It's just
record
proof of
keeping exercise.
identity. Yeah.
It's a proof of
Mhm.
identity.
Yeah.
Whether that is enough for a person to be able to show that he's not an illegal migrant is another story altogether. I may
True.
have a
Yeah.
driving license today, but how does that,
Yeah.
or I may have any other ID card, I may have an Aadhaar
Hmm.
card,
A voter ID.
I may have a voter ID card, etc.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you say that these documents are enough to,
Prove.
establish the fact
Hmm.
that the person concerned is not an Indian citizen, or
Hmm.
is at least not an illegal migrant? Because,
Right.
like I said, the
Yeah.
legal position is if you're an illegal migrant, you are never ever
Eligible
going
for
to
citizenship.
be
Yeah.
eligible for citizenship. So
Hmm.
that's a story in itself.
Hmm.
Yes,
Hmm.
now this issue, now the critics of course say that you will use the NRC to discriminate, etc., etc.
Hmm.
Now
Hmm. Hmm.
now any well-meaning government will never do that. They will just go
Hopefully
by the
not. Yeah.
process. They will go by the
Hmm.
process. Even in fact today, there is no, I don't think, maybe the rules will throw some more light on it, but today there is no clarity on what all documents also. In fact, there was a press information that we've covered in the book also. There was a press information circular, I remember, where the
Hmm. Hmm.
government was trying to distinguish between the CAA and the
Hmm.
NRC. And in that,
Right.
the government, in fact, very candid, in fact, in the press circular, it was very clearly stated that as of today, there is no clarity, or there is a decision that is yet to be taken as to
Hmm.
what
Hmm.
documents will be considered relevant for determining or
True.
ascertaining a person's citizenship.
True.
So I think
Yeah.
that still needs to. So here,
Hmm.
this exercise, in principle, I don't see anything wrong with an exercise like that. If a person is an
Right.
Indian citizen, because you see, it's not going to be as simple as a document. You show me a license, and I agree that you are an Indian citizen. If a
Right.
person is not able to have or show sufficient documentation, there can be several other ways, such as inquiries. In fact, that is exactly
Hmm.
what has happened in the Assam NRC also. So
Yes.
the
Yeah.
undocumented persons had an opportunity to show through neighbors, through other
Hmm.
citizens, other
Yes.
people
Yeah.
who have already been declared as
Verified.
Indian citizens to come.
Yeah.
Yes, so this verification, there is a 2 or 3 prong verification exercise. Then you can,
Hmm.
in fact, contest it, etc. So there is a process by which one can even establish. So as long as
Hmm.
that is done scrupulously,
Yes.
I don't see. I personally, that's my view.
Yeah.
I don't personally see a problem with an NRC.
Right. Yeah.
Assam is already doing it, and
Yes. Yeah.
if it has to be made an instrument or a weapon, if you want some, then it's a different story. But as long as if
Right.
it's done properly, I think
Yes.
that is something that should be done.
Right. Yeah.
Just to point out,
Y-
there was an NRC
hmm.
carried out in 1951 also. So there is already, that was
Hmm.
of course
There already
immediately
has
post
been.
partition. They had one in
Yes.
1951. I'm sure that was, and the
Yeah.
reason was very clear. Immediately post partition, they wanted to do. I'm assuming that would have been
Hmm.
on in mind when that exercise would have been carried out.
Yeah. Because India has at various points of time seen huge influxes of
To
refugees
this very date,
from
to this
to
very
this
date,
very day.
correct.
Yes.
To this
Yeah.
very date.
Yeah.
So of
Yeah.
course, it's a sticky issue. It's a
Yes.
ticklish issue, but it needs to be addressed.
Yes. Yeah. In a way, it's something similar to the United States, which has a huge influx from Latin America.
Correct,
So
correct.
there's been this whole issue and discussion about should we issue work permits but not citizenship to uh, again illegal
The mig
immigrants into the
illegal
country. Yeah.
migrants, correct. So
Yes.
that,
Yeah.
so we need to. I think it's
Yeah.
one or two amendments will not change. I think it will require a generation of change to
Yes.
ultimately
Yeah.
address the problem of illegal migration, especially in India.
True. Yeah. You've mentioned Assam as a special case, and I should just mention here that I grew up in Assam and I have seen
Okay,
that border and how complex it is. To the
okay, all
extent that
right.
you even see individual houses where the border pillar is in the yard of the house. You know, so the border pillar that demarcates the border between India and Bangladesh. So it just shows how complex the whole border is. Um, and of course we know that there's been a huge influx of refugee population and also illegal immigration from our neighbor. So the genesis of the NRC happened with the Assam Accord in 1985, which was signed for the purpose of checking extensive illegal migration into Assam from neighboring Bangladesh, which we know is a well-established fact. Thereafter, the concept has been extended to the rest of the country with an NPR, or National Population Register. Why, again, in your view, has there been opposition to this concept of
Like I
the
said,
national?
the
Yeah.
the NPR is yet to be. I don't think there is anything. In fact,
Hmm.
the government, at least to my knowledge and understanding, hasn't said anything about carrying out an NPR on a nationwide
Right.
or a pan India basis, at least
Basis.
until now. But
Right.
NPR would be, I would say, something similar to the NPR and the NRC are by and large similar concepts. It
Yes.
is
Closely related. Yes. Yeah.
very closely related. Ultimately, I would call both of them a housekeeping exercise. The objection,
Right.
of course, is the same. They say that you will use it as an instrument of damage.
Hmm.
You will discriminate.
Yeah.
You will, instead of
Hmm.
weeding out, you will probably use it to harass and to
Hmm.
persecute. But now,
Right.
of course, like I said, anything that if this is done scrupulously, I see no
Yeah.
reason why there should be a problem. But as long as it's done scrupulously.
Yes.
So, in anticipation of persecution,
Right. Yeah.
so the critics anticipate a persecution very well. I am not saying that they are right
Right.
or wrong. If an exercise
Hmm.
like this is done
Hmm.
in a not so scrupulous and a not so proper manner, then of
Hmm.
course
Yeah.
there could be issues and problems. But very well, I
Yes.
mean, it's too early to start criticizing before something has really even taken off.
Very true. Yeah. The entire northeast of India, and specifically the state of Assam, has faced the severe issue of illegal migration. So, in this regard, there was an IMDT, or Illegal Migrants Determination by Tribunal
Correct.
Act,
Correct.
and this was struck down by the Supreme Court in 2004. So,
That's right.
could you shed some more light on this decision by the Supreme
Yes.
Court?
So what, if you permit, I'll go a little
Mhm.
back and I'll
Yes, please.
start from
Yeah.
the Assam Accord.
Right. Yeah.
The Assam Accord, as everybody is in fact aware, was actually brought into effect to in fact curb the problem of illegal migration. That was, so 1971 was the war.
Right.
A lot of migration, of course, it had been happening since the partition of 1947, but it sort of
Yeah.
intensified in that
Yeah.
decade or so. So in order to
Yes.
curb that, this Assam Accord was brought into force. The objective was very
And
simple. They said yes, there was a cutoff date of some March 1965, if I'm not wrong. They said
mhm,
people who have come prior to 65 will be
mhm.
considered Indian citizens, no questions asked. So even if
Right.
you're an illegal
Yeah.
migrant, we will still take you in, and you will be illegal.
Yeah.
These people, most of these people would have been illegal migrants then. So all
Right.
of them were given en masse
Citizenship.
citizenship of India.
India.
People coming between 1965 and 1971 would
Mhm,
have to undergo a process of registration, a
mhm,
disenfranchisement, that is not being given an option to vote, stay in
mhm,
India or
mhm,
stay in Assam for a decade, and then ultimately
mhm.
also get the same status of citizenship.
Right.
So
Yeah.
these people, of course, mean they had to undergo some sort of a penance of sorts, that you get yourself
Up-
registered, then you will be disenfranchised, and then eventually in 10
mhm.
years, if we see that you are here and you are staying in Assam, we'll give you citizenship.
Right. Yeah.
And of course, all people subsequent to 1971 were to be weeded out and ultimately deported, because there was no benefit
Mhm.
available to them. Now
Right.
the idea was this. Now the IMDT Act, as you're aware, was brought in.
Mhm,
Although it was brought in with an objective of actually helping with the Assam Accord, or actually
mhm,
the objective was to actually weed out. But actually, in
mhm,
2004, the Supreme Court realized that it is doing more harm than good.
mhm,
It had in fact complicated the process of
mhm,
detection and
mhm,
determination of citizenship of or illegal
mhm,
migrants. In fact, the success rate was very poor.
mhm.
Extra pressure on the infrastructure with no desired
Right.
results. So
Right.
ultimately, they said that nothing doing, we will have to set this aside. This is what
Mhm.
ultimately the court ultimately
Mhm.
the constitutionality was very successfully challenged, which is also called as
Right.
the Sabrananda Sonowal judgment, who's now the chief minister also there.
Yes. Yeah.
Subsequently, certain other efforts were also made. We call it the IMDT Act 2, or
Mhm.
that was also, of course, on similar lines, ultimately
Mhm.
rejected. It is only ultimately in the year 2014, when the Supreme
Mhm.
Court finally said enough is enough. We are going to carry out an NRC in the manner provided under the Citizenship Act. So no
Right.
extra laws coming in which are needlessly complicating the entire process, and we will
Mhm.
ultimately carry it out. So the IMDT
Right.
Act, in fact, was a failure,
Mhm.
which in fact the Supreme Court, that's a very long judgment. The Supreme Court, in fact, records in detail the various negatives of this law,
Okay. All
starting
right.
from infrastructure, starting from the laws, how they are making it and making the process of detection and determination even more onerous. Rather than simplifying the process, they're actually making it onerous.
Mhm. Oh, okay.
And
Mhm.
yes, but ultimately, yes, it was set aside. And as we are all aware, in
Mhm.
2014, the Assam NRC
Mhm.
started, and in 2019 the draft NRC list came out, where about 19
Right.
odd lakh people have been excluded. So I
Mhm.
think now that matter is already in court. The foreigners tribunals are already hearing appeals, so all the excluded persons basically have an option to question that or assail
Yes.
that in
Yeah.
a court. That is the foreigners
Yeah.
tribunal that we call. And I think my
Yes.
understanding is that these matters, many of these matters would, or most of them in fact, would be pending in these foreign tribunals.
Right. Yeah.
So this is where we are with the Assam NRC.
Right. Um, it is a fact that in a country like India, documentation may be hard to produce. And also, with, let's say, natural
Absolutely.
disasters, floods, and so forth, documentation may be destroyed, may not be in the possession of the person. So, in such cases, how does a person then prove their citizenship?
That's exactly what, that's something that the government, I feel, needs to address. Like I said, that
Right.
till date
Mhm.
there is no, in fact, very recently, in fact, we've covered some of those judgments also. I was reading another judgment where the court actually concluded, in fact, a question was with respect to establishing citizenship. They in fact examined
Mhm.
the whole host of identity documents,
Mhm.
and ultimately concluded that none of these documents are sufficient to establish citizenship. So, in
Okay.
other words, there is really some
Hmm.
clarity that needs to come as to what all documents are necessary or would be
Mhm.
required to establish citizenship. And even more
Mhm.
importantly, in case, like you correctly pointed out, that there is this problem of undocumented citizenships. I'm not citizenship. There would be citizens who are not,
Mhm.
I'm not saying they're not Indian
Mhm.
citizens, but perhaps
Yeah.
you have people from the,
Yeah.
there are tribals, and there are other
Yes.
people
Yeah.
who are, from
Huh.
vernacular
Yes.
areas, who
Yeah.
may not have the desired document. That doesn't make them
Right.
non-Indian citizens, but they
No,
still don't have.
absolutely not. Yeah.
Maybe it, I think that it would be good to have some sort of, maybe the CAA rules will throw something on it, although I don't think so, because
Mhm.
that's not what they're dealing with. But yes, a
Mhm.
detailed verification process, or
Mhm.
which gives direction or clarity to show as
Mhm.
to how undocumented citizens would be examined,
Right.
to
Yeah.
check or to verify as to whether they are Indian citizens or not.
Yes.
So this
So.
will definitely, in fact, I think that even in the Assam, the judgments that we've read, in fact, um, I have inserted, I think, most of the judgment that had come out, at least until the day the
Mhm.
book went to press.
Mhm.
In most cases, the Guwahati High Court was dealing with issues where a person could not establish, because of the absence of documents, he couldn't establish citizenship, and then
Right.
unfortunately the process had to move to a inquiry or a verification process, or a,
Right.
section where,
Mhm.
in fact, there were statements taken from neighbors, there were statements
Yes.
taken from relatives who had already
Mhm.
been declared as Indian citizens,
Right.
or
Yes.
from other people of credibility, etc., who would be there,
Right.
because ultimately they will have to show a family tree. They'll have to show how
Yes.
it's not
Yeah.
only them being Indian citizens, it's not about just
It's
them being
yeah.
born. Like I pointed out, by
No.
birth, if we
Mhm.
go back, everything, it's all one
Huh.
concept, right?
True.
So
Yeah.
after 2003, the legal position is very clear that once, even if one of the parent is an illegal migrant, the
Right.
newborn
Yes.
does not become a citizen merely by birth.
Right. Yeah.
So I think this is one
Mhm.
department that needs some thinking and maybe greater clarity, which I'm assuming will
Yes.
come in some time. But as of today, I think these issues are still open.
Yeah. The cutoff date for application of CAA is 31st December 2014. Has the government provided any specific reason for this cutoff date?
See, cutoff when it comes to issues of migration,
Mhm.
cutoff dates are obviously there, and there has to be a cutoff date. You
Right.
can't go
Yeah.
indefinitely backward or you can't go indefinitely
No.
forward,
No. No.
right?
Of course not. Yeah.
It has always been a contentious issue. You will
Mhm.
find a cutoff everywhere. So even when we see the
Yeah.
Assam Accord, we see like we discussed 1965,
Yes.
then
Mhm.
1971.
Yeah.
There were cutoffs.
Yes. Yeah.
Similarly, if you go even further back, in fact, you'll be surprised. Even when there was, in fact, I've discussed that in the book in the chapter of citizenship itself. That
Mhm.
when the partition took place,
Mhm.
19 between 1947 to 1948,
Right.
there was very easy access uh,
Yeah.
between India and Pakistan. So lots of people
Yes.
came to India, then they realized they did not want to
Yes.
be in India. They went back. I'm
They
sure
went
that would
back.
have happened even otherwise, people going to Pakistan,
Yes.
coming back, etc. So certain
True.
laws had been enacted even then
Mhm.
to try and say that if you are to actually decide that if you are in India on a certain date,
Mhm.
that is the date of enactment of this law, then we will consider you to be an Indian citizen, unless you
All
go
right.
back, of course, and vice
Okay.
versa. Basically,
Right.
the objective, why I'm saying this is because there was a cutoff date even there.
Okay. Yeah.
So, my honest belief, yes. Now, this is also a subject of criticism. They say this cutoff date has no
Mhm.
basis.
Okay.
Now, the question is personally and very practically speaking, I don't know whether it is possible to have an explanation for a cutoff date every time.
Mhm. Okay.
My sense is that maybe there's a cutoff date of December 2014, perhaps because the first notification which
Mhm.
actually exempted illegal migrants, who ultimately became beneficiaries of the CAA from prosecution
Right.
under passport laws and foreigners laws, actually came out in 2015.
All right. Okay.
So basically, this beneficiary section, which we see under the CAA, has been
Mhm.
protected from prosecution under the
Right.
Passports
Yeah.
Act. Normally, the law is that if you're an illegal migrant, you will be proceeded against Passports Act. There is also the Indian
Of course.
Foreigners Act, so you could be proceeded
Yes.
against them. So these
Yeah.
notifications, in fact, had exempted them from being prosecuted
Right.
under those
Yeah.
laws.
All
So the
right.
CAA actually is like the final step. These people are
Right.
already a
Yeah.
protected class. There
Yes.
have been
Yeah.
RBI notifications also, which I've covered in the book, which actually shows how
Yes.
these people were also permitted. And this is all prior to
Mhm.
CAA, mind you. This is 2015,
Yes.
16, 17, 18,
Yeah.
where
Mhm.
the RBI, in fact, permitted these persons to obtain one property for residential purposes also.
Right.
So the
Yes.
process of
Yeah.
a
Um,
rehabilitation exercise for these people had already started. So the final step was to finally
yeah.
give them the ultimate license, that is of citizenship in India.
Yes. Because
So
they've
that's
come
my
as
guess.
refugees. Yeah.
Correct. So my guess is
Yeah.
it could be that I have no, in
Yeah.
fact, at least there is nothing in the literature we've tried to or public domain which actually explains why there is a cutoff date of
All right.
December 2014. But like I said, it has to be there. It is always there, and it is
Yes.
always a
Yeah.
contentious issue.
Right. So it's probably
I'm
in
sure it will
keeping
be
with
dealt with
other
by the
related
Supreme Court.
judgments.
Correct. Ultimately, I'm sure
Yeah.
it will be dealt with, like I said. So,
Yes.
everything is in fact before in challenge before the Supreme Court, including the
Supreme Court.
notifications that I just described
Yeah.
very briefly, as well as the cutoff date issue, the absence
Right.
of basis. So, I'm sure the Supreme Court will ultimately examine this when the time
And
comes.
comment on it. So, given that these are such complex and yet very interesting issues for the future of the citizens of our country, what do you see as the road ahead with regard to the CAA and NRC?
See, the first thing is that I think the first thing is that it has to pass muster before the Supreme Court.
Right.
The Constitution, it is already
Mhm.
challenged in the Supreme Court.
Yeah. Mhm.
The government, in any case, is simultaneously formulating rules for the purposes
Hmm.
of enact for which will describe the modalities for
Yes.
obtain for this beneficiary CAA category to ultimately obtain
Right.
Indian citizenship. So
Right.
I think that the issue doesn't just stop at the Supreme Court saying yes or no, giving its thumbs up or thumbs down to this. I
True.
don't think that's the final thing. That's in fact only the starting point. I say that in fact the problems begin from there,
Right.
because once you carry out and I see more than the CAA, the problem will be with the NRC. See what
Yes.
happens when
Yeah.
you carry out an NRC. When you carry out an NRC, you will obviously detect thousands and lakhs and maybe crores in our case, illegal migrants. And when you're doing this on a pan
Yeah.
India basis, mind you, it's going to be
Yes.
it's amplified
Yeah.
really
Massive
large
scale. Yeah.
on a very massive scale. Now, these are persons who are, of course, not citizens of India. That's
Right.
as we've detected them. Now, for a successful deportation of such persons, it is also
Yeah.
important that the host country also recognizing them.
Which,
Very
as we know, in
recent,
many cases already doesn't happen.
that doesn't happen. In fact, it is
Hmm.
already, in fact, we were reading somewhere that, in fact, Bangladesh has a habit of, in fact,
Refusing
not
to acknowledge.
acknowledging, yes,
Yeah.
refusing to acknowledge their own.
Yeah.
So ultimately, what do? These are people.
Yes.
So if your own country doesn't recognize you, you are
True.
detected as an illegal migrant here, so you're not a citizen here.
Yes.
What really
Yeah.
happens? So what
You're a sort of
happens?
stateless person then.
Stateless. So
So,
that's also a
yeah.
concept. So what now
Right.
in India once again is not a signatory to any of the international conventions on statelessness.
Hmm.
Here what happens is that of everything is governed by the refugee policy. But the problem is,
Right.
what do you do with them? You put them in
Yes.
detention. It's more of a
Yeah.
lifelong detention than for them.
Yes. Yeah. If you.
Which
Yeah.
I'm not really talking of the litigation. I am not really talking
Hmm.
of. I think when it comes to infrastructure is going to be, of course, these
A
are
major
people who will
issue.
probably then,
Hmm.
it's a detention center. They will have to be, you will have to, in other words, despite the fact that they're illegal migrants, you will have to rehabilitate
Hmm.
them in some way, because ultimately they
Of
will have to
course.
earn a livelihood, do something about it. Otherwise, it's a
Yes.
full burden.
Yeah.
But at the same time, continue to be here. So
Right.
how do you
Yeah.
address? So it's not, the NRC will actually result in a lot of things like that. And it's not, and of
True.
course, what do you do with the stateless persons?
Yes. Yeah.
And also, when in fact even coming to the CAA, if I would, it's not
Hmm.
just giving them citizenship that is enough. I
Hmm.
think there
Hmm.
has to be a proper rehabilitation also.
Of course. Of course. The
These
two
are
have to
people
go
who are not,
together.
they have
Yes.
to have
Yeah.
to go together. So it's just not
Yeah.
enough to say that okay, from henceforth you're an Indian citizen.
Yes.
You
Right.
have to go
Yeah.
one step forward. So all of these things,
Further.
I'm sure, will be these are just, I mean, I would say the tip of the iceberg. So I'm sure
Right.
there are
Yeah.
lots of other issues. We've, of course, in fact, there is a
Yeah.
separate chapter in the book which is dedicated to the road ahead. In fact,
Yes.
the
Yeah.
idea is to
Completely.
really carve out or crystallize or
Yeah.
sort of departmentalize issues that
Yes.
the
Yeah.
government may have to contend with in the
True.
near
Yeah.
future, assuming that the NRC is carried out and the
Yes. Yeah.
CAA is also given full effect to.
Right. No, you have explained all these matters very clearly and lucidly in your book, which I'm sure will be very helpful to uh, people who have to deal with these issues in the course of their work, and also students, not just of law, but various other aspects of public policy and so forth in this country.
Correct. I hope
So,
so too.
and thank you also for explaining the various points we've discussed today so clearly. I think we're sort of running out of time. So let me ask the organizers if we have questions from the audience, because I think we have some time to deal with questions. Okay, so we have Aditya Bharat who's saying, great conversation, sir. Why is the law always a complex subject in India? Your comments, please. May I
I
just
don't
say to
think
Aditya, read the book. It helps simplify the law tremendously. Yeah, so
I
go ahead.
think no. It's not about doing. It's not really complex. The idea is that if you can break it down into proper parts, or break it
Yes,
down into categories and understand it. I think that's not
yeah,
only with law. I think that applies to every industry. It
yeah,
applies to every sector. If you can break down, of course, we are more lawyers are more theory based, because it's all documented.
right,
You have laws, you have judgments, etc. But I think
yeah,
if properly broken down and discussed in a proper manner, I don't think it's as complex as
yeah,
uh, And of course, i- since it's theoretical, we can choose to make it as complex as we want, or as simple as we like.
Right.
So it really depends on how you see it, but
Yeah.
I don't per se think that law is a complex subject, and per se.
Right. And clearly, you've taken it upon yourself to help explain matters to the general public through your books
That's
as
the
well.
endeavor. That's the endeavor. The
Yeah.
idea is to write it in a manner. In fact, it's written in a manner so that it's clear, or
Yeah.
easy to comprehend, even for persons who are not really lawyers, and people,
Right.
maybe are, but are somewhat either interested in this area or subject, or are probably,
Yeah.
like you said, law researcher or researchers or policymakers, etc.
Yeah. No, it's
Should be
certainly
a
a matter of
should be
interest to the general public as well. Okay. So we have another question from Mr. Sushanta Das, who says, Sir, taking into account the surging native population, should we become liberal in granting citizenship? Whatever parameters refugees may meet, we have to give space to them since we do not have dual citizenship.
Now that's a very tricky
Hmm.
thing,
Hmm.
because
Yeah.
when you start giving citizenship liberally, see, it's not that we don't already have a population problem in the country.
Hmm.
Let's
Hmm.
be
Yeah.
very clear.
Yeah.
And over the years, in fact, I've decided we didn't have an option to discuss it threadbare, but when somebody
Hmm.
reads the citizenship chapter of the book, he or
Hmm.
she will realize how they've tightened the rules and the norms over the years in an effort
Yes.
to curb the problem of illegal migration. Like I said, even
Right.
with birth, it was so liberal earlier. Even if you were two
Yeah.
foreigners giving birth,
Hmm.
so the child had an opportunity to become. Of course, they may ultimately not take it
Yeah.
up. That's a separate story. But it was
Yeah.
so. It started out with that. That's how liberal we were,
Yeah.
and over the years, we've sort of curtailed it,
Yes.
because
Yeah.
the problem is liberalizing citizen grant of citizenship will really not help the population problem of the country.
No, of
So
course.
now if I look at it from a if I look at it from a humanitarian point of view, then of course you have to, if there is somebody here rightly or wrongly, should be
Hmm.
rehabilitated, should be assisted, helped. But I look at it
Hmm.
purely from a uh,
Hmm.
from the person who's not any other point of view. I'm keeping aside the
Right.
humanitarian aspect of it. Then I
Yeah.
think
Yeah.
anybody would say that no, there have to be some curbs. We can't have
Right.
an
Yeah.
indiscriminate and
Yeah.
indefinitely long
Hmm. Yeah.
road when it comes to grant citizenship and be very liberal about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah. You mentioned the point about foreigners in India, and one of the situations India has faced in recent years is that of surrogacy, where many foreigners have come to India and had a child through a surrogate. What is the position of such a child in India? Because clearly, in such a case, the father may be a foreigner and the mother may be an Indian surrogate parent. So,
This
what
is
is then the
again
citizenship of such a child?
Now, this is a very, very tricky and a complex issue. I think this still
Yeah,
needs some sort of judicial intervention. There have been a couple of judgments which has
yeah,
somewhat dealt with it, but the main issue
hmm,
is yet to be discussed and decided, because
oh,
ultimately the question really is, in fact, I don't remember the name of the judgment. I think it was a Kerala High Court judgment where
mhm,
the question really was that the surrogate was Indian,
right,
the
hmm,
parents were not. So ultimately, but in
yeah,
that judgment, the court ultimately went on to conclude that no, we will go by the biological parent.
right, okay,
So
hmm,
in that case, the surrogate becomes the biological parent, because ultimately
yes,
it's the
yeah,
surrogate who's. So we will not go by the uh, mother. We'll go by the real mother in that sense.
okay, the
But like I
biological
said,
mother.
the biological mother. So
Hmm,
we will see. We will examine it from that prism.
right,
Like I said, that of course, but yes, there still needs to be. I think in that judgment, the court ultimately said that the child will be considered an Indian citizen.
I
That
see,
matter, of
okay,
course, did not travel to the Supreme Court, and so, but I think there is still a lot of thinking to be done. But
right,
you're right,
because I
no,
think the,
surrogacy and all these things will crop up, because if you have
yes,
because if I go back to the concept of citizenship by birth, it is imperative
yeah,
that one parent has to be Indian.
correct, yes, yeah,
So here now, whom should the mother be considered? So who should be
Mm.
considered a parent for the purposes of this rule that I just
Yes.
discussed?
Yeah.
So that's I think some more clarity will come. But this, at
Yeah.
least I'm that one solitary judgment that we have. I think from if I look at it from that, if I only look at that judgment, then of course they say that
Yeah.
the parent, for the purposes of understanding who the parent is under the
Mhm.
Citizenship Act, will go by the biological mother.
Right. And I think this is also why the government is trying to regulate commercial surrogacy, and laws are coming into place
Correct,
for that.
correct, correct. That's right.
Yeah. All right. Do we have any more questions? If the organizers could let us know. Any more comments or questions, please? Okay. I think we've probably you've explained everything so clearly that our audience is now probably just left to read the book, which we hope they will all do going forward. So
Hope.
let me conclude things by thanking you for your time today, for answering our questions so patiently, and for explaining everything so clearly to us today.
Thank you for
And
having me, ma'am. Thank you so much.
and thank you also to the team from
The
Kalinga Lit
organizer.
Fest for helping organize this session.
Thank you. Thank you so much.